Hey guys, I'm here with Mike Aquilina, author, editor of more than 50 books. It's mind blowing. I always had the dream of doing one book, but let alone getting up to 50. That's mind blowing. That includes The Fathers of the Church, The Mass of the Early Christians, Angel of Gods, and plenty other books that I need to dive into. Thank you, Mike, for being here.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Do you mind, besides that, giving a brief introduction on yourself to everyone that's watching?
Hmm. Well, I've been working in the publishing business for 40 years this year. So
Wow.
I've been in it for a while. I've worked in a lot of different kinds of publishing. For the most part, the last 30 years or so, I've been doing mostly Catholic media. So I've published some books, as you point out, and a lot of articles, and I've hosted some TV shows and that kind of thing.
Oh, awesome! Yeah, I started diving into the one podcast you're doing, the Ways of the Fathers. I really enjoyed that. The quick little breakdowns you have of each of them, which we'll touch on one in a second. But were you always this interested in the fathers, and was it always something a part of your faith that you wanted to dive into this, or was this something that just naturally over time you kind of dove into?
I don't know about always, but when I was a little boy, I can remember in our classroom at school, we had two bookshelves. One was for girls, and the other one was for boys. And the boys' shelves had lots of books about cowboys and pioneers and books about World War II and books about sports figures. And on those shelves was also a book about Heinrich Schliemann, the the man who discovered Troy. He was the archaeologist who discovered Troy. So I guess on a whim, I picked up that book once and I read it, and I was enthralled from beginning to end of that book. I wanted to be like Schliemann. I wanted to be someone who went overseas on this voyage and put a spade into the ground and turned up some famous city from some ancient epic, and probably a lot of gold and maybe a temple or two as well. So I wanted to be that guy, that kind of archaeologist. But as I grew up, I learned that archaeologists work hard and their work can be very tedious, and you have to be patient. And I was not patient, and I wasn't good with tedious work. So I wasn't going to sit there with a toothpick and a toothbrush, just waving over the dirt for weeks. Um, when I got older, I continued reading the works of antiquity, but that was my way of doing archaeology. I really enjoyed reading about ancient times. Some people gravitate uh, toward the Middle Ages, and they or the Renaissance. They go to Ren fairs, right? And that sort of thing. I've always been drawn to antiquity, and I'm still waiting for them to do patristic fairs.
So, what got you specifically into the fathers? Was that something that you wanted to get into, or was that something you were tasked with doing, and then it naturally led to all the books you've written from then on?
I just kind of wandered into it when I was an undergraduate. Um, I was taking some classes in religious studies. There was a professor I really liked his courses, and I took his classes, and I ended up doing an independent study with him on Irenaeus of Lyon. And it was a semester long study, and it was 3 credits, and I did a deep dive on Irenaeus, and I was very young at the time, so I think that just made an impression on me, and it let me know that there was a lot that could be read, a lot that could be known in that field. So I poked around in it for a long time. Again, I was working in secular publishing at the time, so I wasn't about to get an assignment on any of these topics, but I was doing some reading in them in my spare time.
So, how do you, when you start diving into, take me through the process of you get an idea for a book. How does that happen? Do you have this overarching idea, or is it something you're starting to read and you're like, oh, that's an interesting idea, and you start making connections between different topics? Like, how do you go from? It just seems so difficult with the amount of from what I've seen in your books, that it's just the amount of research that goes into them.
Well, I think when I'm reading, I do make those connections, as you say. I try to relate what I'm reading today to what I've read in the past, and I'll go down these rabbit holes, and and uh, and I'll start to gather information together. If I get interested in a topic like music in the early church, I'll start making notes of the things I find that are interesting. Get some books on this subject from the library, buy some books, do some research online, and gradually, I'll get a critical mass of material, and I'll be able to articulate an idea for a book and run it by a publisher.
Oh, so do you do you have multiple books at once that you're kind of going through with multiple different ideas, or do you kind of hone in on one idea when you're kind of formulating it all?
I think that these are things that are all just bubbling around in my mind until I write up a proposal. I don't think of them as books until they get accepted by a publisher, and I'm off and running with the project.
So one of the main books you're known for is the Fathers of the Church. So I guess the question I ask to you, why should we care about the Fathers of the Church? You hear a lot of people talk about them, but what's the importance of those individuals, the Fathers of the Church?
I think we all know instinctively what the importance is. People spend millions of dollars doing genealogy work. They want to dig up into their own roots, right? They want to find their ancestors. So they scrape for DNA. They put it out there. They find their relatives. They work out these family trees online and everything. And people are really caught up in this. I've known a few people who spent their entire retirement on finding their ancestors, making that family tree, trying to fill in all those empty boxes. Because we're trying to figure out who we are, where we came from, and where we're heading, right? So it helps if we know who our predecessors are, what was their trajectory, how did they get to where they ended up, and I think we're all drawn that way. I really do think that that's what draws us to to read books about the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the late 1940s by a shepherd boy, right? And gradually, very gradually, they began to be published. And people bought these things by the tens and hundreds of thousands of copies. Uh, and I think they were fascinated by it because it was this glimpse into the world of the first century. It was a glimpse into the world of our Lord from the founding years of Christianity. So I think it's a natural thing that we want to know about those years. We want to know where we came from. We want to know where we're going. I think that we all have a fascination like this. I think of the series The Chosen, which is now in its fourth season or something like that, and it's as popular as ever. People are just drawn to it. They want to know what it was like back then because they know this is the first generation of Christianity. These are my people. This is where I came from. So they're looking for an imaginative entry into the world of the first century, the world of Jesus, the world of the apostles. And that's what I've always tried to give is an imaginative entry into the world of the church fathers. So by that, we mean the great teachers of Christianity from the first century until the 8th century. So I've tried to help people to look into that world and see how we developed, where we came from, where these big ideas that we profess in the creed came from.
Yeah, and I could see why you're interested in archaeology because it ties in where you're diving it down these rabbit holes of
Yeah.
trying to figure out different connections of different church fathers and understanding their writings and kind of digging up all those um, artifacts, so to speak, of a lot of what they're were teaching and writing out. And it's very exciting just to hear you speak on this. And so, what when it comes to how much information do we have about say the early church fathers? I know there's a good amount of writings, and how much information do we have? Is there a gap in time period of these church fathers, or is there a consistent period of time that we have all of their writings that kind of give a seamless timeline, so to speak.
Well, as you might expect, the number of surviving writings increases as the church increases in size, right? So we have just a few writings from the first 75 years of Christianity, just a few. We have the New Testament, and then we have the works of the apostolic fathers. Okay, so it continues, from there to increase outward as we get into this generations and centuries after that. We have a whole lot of works of St. Augustine. We can fill shelves in a library with works of St. Augustine, and he's writing in the 4th and 5th centuries. So by then we have a church that's intent on preserving the great works of the great teachers. Now, that required a lot of effort. You got to remember that we're living in a time, or they were living in a time before the printing press, long before the printing press, long before there were any electronic media, of course. So the only way to preserve a text was by copying it out by hand. And back then, you had to pay to have that done, pay some scribe to give days of his time to copy out the book that you want. And in the case of something like St. Augustine's City of God, you're talking about a hefty book, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe in multi-volumes back then. So you have to pay skilled labor to do that. It's very expensive, and you can only have one copy at the end of it, right? You don't do multiple copies. So there's no mass production of books, and the books themselves are not written out on acid-free paper or anything like that, any of these innovations of the 20th century. So they degrade pretty quickly. And if the book is very valuable to you or to your library or to your church or to your monastery, you've got to have it copied out again and again, generation after generation, so that it will survive on that paper that's got a high acidic content and is going to degrade pretty quickly. So the ancient Christians put a lot of effort into preserving these great texts of the great teachers. And we do have a lot of them. I mean, right now you can probably see some shelves full of books behind me. Most of those are about the fathers or by the fathers. If you could see in front of me, I have a wall full of books that are mostly by the fathers, the various series that have been put out in the last 100 years of the writings of the fathers in translation. So I have quite a library just in my office, and my collection here is nowhere near complete.
So I guess I could hear so many skeptics, so to speak, ringing in my ears. How do we trust the people that were copying, that they did it accurately and allowed? How can we be confident in what we receive these days of the early church father writings?
Well, that's always a concern, but in the case of Augustine, you might find many, many, many manuscripts of a book, and they're distributed throughout the world because Augustine was very popular even within his lifetime. He was revered as a theological authority, as a genius, and consulted very often. So there are many copies of some of these books, and you can compare them to one another. See if there are any differences in the books. So you're never quite sure that everything is as it came from the author's pen, but you can be pretty sure. You can also go through and just compare it with what other people were saying at the time. And a lot of people were quoting Augustine even during his lifetime. So you can compare the quotes of Augustine to what's there in the book. So you do the best you can, but you have to think that with all of these books, which are translated from many different manuscripts, sometimes that they get to a text that's somewhat representative, at least.
Yeah, I guess it's the same arguments when they talk about the New Testament and Old Testament. How can we be
Right.
sure about the translations and all of that? But if you can compare them all together, you should be able to kind of find some commonality between it. Do you ever think about all the writings we have now and kind of ponder what writings we actually missed? Because
Oh yeah.
because there's probably stuff that maybe they didn't think was that I guess, as amazing as some of the things they copy down. But then you think we would probably read them and be like, "Oh, this would be great to have now." But it just it boggles the mind that the amount of stuff that was probably lost in the period of time.
Yeah, everyone who reads the Fathers or reads about the Fathers has at least one text that they would love to be discovered. A text they know existed at some point in time, but has been lost to the ages. You think of a writer like Melito of Sardis. We knew of his existence because he's mentioned in the history books. But we didn't have anything from Melito's hand until the 1940s, when a manuscript of Melito was discovered among a pile that were preserved at the University of Michigan. So we're still discovering these things today. Melito has many other writings that are attributed to him, but they're gone. They're missing. The Didache is another work that was known to exist, but we didn't have any copies until the end of the 19th century, when it was discovered in a monastery in Constantinople. So we're still finding things. In the last 50 years, we found homilies of St. Augustine that are recognizable from
Hmm.
quotations in other places and from mentions and lists of his homilies, but we didn't have copies of them until the last 50 years. There are also letters of Augustine that have been discovered in that time. So we're still coming across these things. My own personal wish is that someone somewhere would turn up a copy of the Commentary of the Apocalypse by Melito of Sardis, because that would be our earliest commentary on the book of Revelation, and it would be a wonderful thing to read.
I guess, what would be just the fact that it was he was what period was he writing? If you don't
He
mind me
was in
asking.
the middle of the 100s.
Oh wow, so he was really early on with when that was. So I could see that you would be able to get pretty straightforward connections of what
Right.
was being talked about, because with the book of Revelation, it's just so many people go off on these different tangents of what it means, and you see that a lot on YouTube. But it would be really cool to see an early father actually diving into it and explaining what this all the symbolism would actually mean, because I would have to say, reading some of the early fathers, they know a lot more than the average layman like myself, and being able to make connections to the Old Testament as well.
Yeah, and especially from someone like Melito, who had Jewish sensibilities. He was likely from a Jewish background, and he could read the Apocalypse and understand John's symbols in a way that perhaps we can't, or it's harder for us to do.
Hmm. Um, when I was you started diving into your podcast, Way of the Fathers, I came across the one episode. It was early on, but it was for Ignatius of Antioch, and you said he was your favorite father. Do you mind breaking down, if people don't know who Ignatius actually is, and why is he your favorite?
Well, Ignatius lived in the first century. He was quite likely a hearer of the apostles, a disciple of the apostles, someone who heard the teaching from their own lips. He was, I believe, the third bishop of Antioch. So he's following in the line established by Saint Peter when Peter was there. So Ignatius is someone who's very important, just because he's essentially an eyewitness to the apostolic teaching. Uh, he's but I love him for more than that. He wrote 7 letters, and he was on his way to his martyrdom. He was to die. He was sentenced in Syrian Antioch, but he was going to die in Rome. Um, so uh, so he was going across land and sea, and he's going along the way there, and he wrote some letters along the way, 7 letters, and we have those letters today. And what I love about them is that they don't make arguments. He's not doing apologetics or anything like that. He's just trying to preach to
Hmm.
these people along the way in the different churches. So he writes letters to the churches, and he writes one letter to his friend Polycarp of Smyrna, who was bishop there, and who was also a disciple of St. John the Apostle. So Ignatius wrote these letters, and he doesn't argue for anything. He just states things as they are. And what does he say? What do we see in his letters? We see a parish that looks a lot like ours when we see the church of the year 107 AD when he wrote these letters. We see a church that's centered on the Eucharist. We see a church that's structured according to deacons, priests, and bishops. We see a church that makes a distinction between the clergy and the lay people in terms of the spiritual gifts that we have. We see a church that believes that Jesus Christ is true God and that he is true man. Ignatius makes all of these things very clear, and he calls that church the Catholic Church, the universal church. So he's valuable for people who want to do apologetics later on, even though he himself was not an apologist. Really, he was a preacher, he was a bishop, and he was trying to get a message across. His voice is very warm, and he's very close to Jesus, and he wants to be like Jesus. He knows the gospel very well, and he wants to live the gospel more perfectly. He wants to live as Jesus lived, and he wants to die as Jesus died. He says to the people in Rome, "Grant me nothing more than that I be ground like wheat in the teeth of lions, to be made purebred for Jesus Christ." He wants to die as a martyr, shedding his blood for Jesus, because Jesus had done that for him.
That
So Ignatius is just this warm figure we have from the very early years of the church, and he shows us what the church looked like at that time.
and that's reading about him. It's just kind of inspiring that he was in that mindset, and I can only imagine somebody going through that, but handling it with such, it seems like such grace that he
Yes.
was able to do this. And compared to that, to us today, where we get a little bit of suffering, we're just calling out to God, like, why? He was on his way to basically be martyred, which,
Yes.
how unusual was, because I've heard conflicting things of it being unusual that he was taken from Antioch to bring all the way to
It
Rome
is.
to do that. But was that an unusual thing to actually happen? Which then it makes you think of, was that God's providence to bring him to Rome?
Well, here's my take on it. I think the authorities were becoming alarmed by the growth of the Christian church, right? So they didn't want to do a full-scale persecution. They wanted to take out the leaders, right? To make examples of them. And their idea was to make an example of him by sending him to Rome, where it would be a big example, where it would be big news, right? And he could die in the Colosseum with a lot of people watching, and the message would go out everywhere that this is how Christians would be treated. And along the way along the route there, I imagine that his military escort would bring him out and show him to the people and tell the people in that city what was going to happen to him when he got to Rome, that he was going to be ground like wheat in the teeth of lions. And they expected the people to see a man terrified of what he was about to face. And he wasn't terrified. He was joyful. He was courageous. He was just stalwart. And the people saw this. I think those were the motivations going through. And I think Ignatius was a true leader in that he knew the value of his behavior, that it would be exemplary when they brought him out. And so he tried to set an example. He tried to set an example of joy and courage that shows in his letters. I'll bet it showed in his physical presence as well.
Yeah, it's kind of it's funny that this tactic that they did probably would have worked, or probably did work, with other say nations that they went up against in those times. But now looking back on history, it's just one of those things like, well, that's actually, it was complete opposite for the Christians at that time. And I would love to see just that progression. I'm shocked there hasn't been, say, a dramatic movie or series or something made about somewhat of that that period of time, because that just seems like such a dramatic event of just early history that would be such an amazing retelling.
I think that if I had a lot of money and I could fund a
If
movie
only.
about one of the church fathers, it would be Ignatius of Antioch, because there's a lot of drama in the story. There's a lot of beauty in the story. But the more the Romans played this game, the more the church grew. Tertullian remarks at the end of the 100s, he says, "The more you mow us down, the more we spring back up. The blood of the martyrs is seed," he said. "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church." And the church grew up, really grew when it was suffering.
Yeah, wasn't it? It grew by 40% each year, or something along those lines, which is an amazing growth for just a nation or a company or anything. That growth is astronomical.
The sociologist Rodney Stark says that the church grew at a pretty steady rate of 40% per decade for the first 275 years of its existence. It
That's a
just
lot.
kept, yeah, right, just growing that way. And he was not a believer at the time he wrote the book, but he did. He did a study called The Rise of Christianity, and he tried to figure out the reasons why the church grew so quickly, because we all agree that the church grew really quickly and overtook the empire. So he tries to find those reasons, and he put them out there in that book and in the sequel to it, the follow up, where he answers his critics. And that book was called Cities of God.
What was the reasoning for its growth? Because for me, just on the outside looking in, it just seems like it was uh, destined by God, because they went through all these trials and tribulations and martyrdom, and yet they grew consistently. Like outside looking in, you see a group that's constantly being persecuted, and yet it still grew. It seems very providential.
Well, yeah, and I think you're right that the growth is largely attributable to the grace of God. But as Catholics, we believe that grace builds on nature. And so we see certain evidence there that there were good reasons to convert to Christianity, especially for women, especially for children, because women and children enjoyed rights in the church that they did not have in the wider culture. They could be leaders in the church, whereas women were mostly ignored in the wider culture, and so were children. If you think of someone like Saint Perpetua in Carthage, North Africa, she's writing at the very beginning of the 200s, and Perpetua writes a diary that becomes an instant bestseller. Her prison diary becomes an instant bestseller. She dies as a martyr, and she becomes an instant hero. So that we find just a few years after her death, there are images of her venerated in Italy. So so um, so women and children have opportunities in Christianity that they don't have otherwise. They find it very attractive. There is plenty of evidence that most of the converts to Christianity were women, right? Because even the pagans taunted us because of that. Um, it's likely that many of the converts were Jews, that they had a sense of the culture from which Christianity came, and they found this to be the fulfillment of their expectations. That's another reason. Yet another reason is that Christians responded with institutional charity to natural disasters, volcanoes erupting, the earthquakes and famines and pestilence, plague, all of these things that had a Christian response. The Christians took care of their neighbors who were pagan, whereas their own family might have abandoned them. So Christians gained converts just by living their religion and being charitable. So there were many reasons to become Christians, and Stark analyzes them chapter by chapter.
Yeah, and I mean, it seems so counter. I mean, nowadays it's cultural to care about women and children, but back then that was countercultural with how much you look at ancient Roman societies. They basically would cast out children, or they basically had the ability, if I'm not mistaken, you could kill a child with up to the age of 2 or something along those lines. If I'm not mistaken, it was just very countercultural. It was very
Sorry.
counter. That's okay. It was very countercultural to everything going on in the great Roman Empire that essentially was taken down through martyrdom, which is again, it's just funny how no other nation could really conquer Rome through the sword, and it was done through the blood of the martyrs. It's just really amazing, and kind of wonder what we could learn from those early fathers and early Christians as a whole, and how we should behave.
Yeah. It's we should believe what we profess, and we should live what we believe. If we do that, then we'll make an impression as the Christians did. That's what you find over and over again in the uh, early Christian documents, but also in the documents from pagans that talk about the early Christians. They think that these people are superstitious and crazy, but they can't help but admire them. They can't help but admire them for their concern for others, for their courage, for their joy. All of these things that are very attractive qualities, the kinds of things you want in a friend, you want in a spouse. Well, people made friends with the Christians because they were attractive that way. They found spouses among the Christians because they thought they had the qualities to make a good spouse. So so I think that the evangelization that was done by the church in the early centuries was largely done by the laity, and it was done by means of friendship. It was just Christians going out and befriending their neighbors. It was as simple as that.
I think that's a good message for people these days, because we're always so, especially nowadays where everything's so tribal, and
Mm-hmm.
it's just being there for individuals, even if they don't want you there. But your actions probably speak louder than words, and it sounds like that's what the early Christians did. They were just there when there was a natural disaster. They were just there when they were needed, and they looked out for people. And I think we could probably learn a lot from how they handled different crises and how they treated other people, even if they were despised.
Yeah. We can't force people to like us. We can't coerce them into friendship, uh, but we can let them know that we're available anytime they need anything. We can let them know that we're there for them when they have a baby or when they have a death in the family. We can be the one who are there giving them the things they need. When they need a ride, we can be the one offering them a ride, so that they know that they can depend on us, they can rely on us, and they can ask us of things that are even difficult to ask for. Um, I think that's one of the big lessons that we can learn from our ancestors in the faith.
Yeah, and I think it just actions probably speak louder than just you saying something. It's actions that actually result in it, and I think that's one of the keys of the laity. And like you were saying, is bringing people into the church, because I think a lot of times the laity nowadays, because of social media, they get worried about all the politics going on with the churches. That maybe we should just focus on the bringing people into the church and just let Christ, who's the ultimate head, let him sort out the rest, and we just bring in people to the truth. And that seems like what needs to happen these days.
Yeah, and you think about what they had available to them at that time. Christianity, the practice of Christianity was a capital crime. You could die for it if you got arrested. The next day you could be dead. So what did they have at their disposal? They couldn't stand in the forum and start shouting, because then they would get arrested and they would be dead on the morrow. So there's no evidence of people trying to evangelize that way, or handing out leaflets on a street corner or anything like that. There was no printing press to make leaflets, right? um, and most people couldn't read anyway. So what did you do? What was the medium by which you could reach people before there were any of the media that we know today, like television or radio or printed matter? What you could do is be a friend, and that was the way you reached people. That was the only way that the early Christians had available to them, and it wasn't the clergy doing this for the most part. It was ordinary lay people, and I think increasingly it's that way today, because because of the scandals that have taken place, and because of the reduced numbers of the clergy, they are just not available to do a lot of the work of evangelization that we are able to do. And since we are able to do it, that means we should be doing it,
Hmm.
because if we don't do it, no one will.
Yeah, that's I completely agree. Um, if I'm just curious, when you're going through and you're starting to read all these books and starting to write all these books, how much has this solidified your faith when you start reading into the church fathers and their writings? How has that kind of has that solidified your faith? I would assume so, but I don't want to make the
Yeah,
assumption.
I mean, certainly, when you see people who paid the ultimate price for what they believed, it's it's daunting. It's humiliating for me, because I'm puny and
Hmm.
I complain when I have a little bit of a cough like I have today. I make no end of complaint about it, and yet these people endured so much for my sake, and they did it without complaint, and they did it presenting a joyful face to the people who knew them. So yeah, they solidified the faith of those around them, and they still solidify the faith of people who encounter them today. I have to hold myself accountable to what I know of these people who lived so long ago. So not only do I have to hold myself accountable to the lives of the people who are in my parish, who are inspiring to me already, but I also have to hold myself accountable to these other Christians I have encountered from these writings down through the ages.
Yeah, that seems very daunting when you mention that, because we know they're alive in Christ, and they know more than we do now, and they're probably seeing us now. And it just makes me think, oh man, I get upset when I stub my toe.
Right.
I can't imagine what they're thinking about, what we're complaining about these days, with how just good we have it. And maybe that's sort of another version of temptation in today's society, is just the sheer ease of access that we have to a lot of these very superficial things.
Yeah, well, you get to the end of the book of Revelation and you see that they are the great cloud of witnesses, that they're very much alive in Christ. They're very much aware of what we're doing, and they're cheering us on, this cloud of witnesses. That's just a wonderful thing to know. But again, it can be daunting, but it's wonderful to know. They're there to strengthen us. We see it again in the book of Revelation, and we see that they're praying for us. They're there, looking at the situations that we find challenging in our world today, and they're referring them to our Lord. They're interceding for us. They're saying, "How long, O Lord? How long?" So we have them in our corner in so many ways, through their example, through their witness, through their cheering, and through their intercession.
That's what the one thing, because actually it's kind of what I saw earlier today, where people were making a comment about the Chosen, the actor that plays Jesus. He was mentioning that he was talking to, or he was trying to pray, and talking to a friend who passed away, and and they always say that it's necromancy, and it just irks me a little bit. It's like, you just got to look, and we believe that people are alive in Christ even after they go to sleep. They're still alive, and we see that in, like you were mentioning, in Revelation. And it just irks me a little bit when they say that, because I mean, wouldn't you want somebody that's there, that's in the fullness? I have an analogy that's always run in my head, where I would want, if I'm trying to get hired by somebody and I need to go to the hiring manager, and they pass it on to the HR, I would want to talk to every person that's in good standing in that company that gives me a good recommendation. That's
Right.
essentially what I view as intercessory prayer for all the saints up there, is that they're in heaven. So obviously they're better than all of us down here to be able to pray for us. And I just, I want people to understand that we have this great gift of the community that we're all a part of. It can be daunting, like I was saying before, of how they've lived in such they've gone through a lot more trials than I have, that's for sure. But it's we have them in our corner.
I've mentioned the passages in Hebrews and Revelation. St. Paul in his letter to the Colossians also makes the distinction between the saints in the church, right? The saints in the church on earth, the ordinary people we meet who are baptized into Christ, so they're holy. They're sancti, they're saints. But he makes a distinction between them and the saints in light, the saints in light. And when we go to the saints in light, we know that we're going to people who live in the presence of God. We have that assurance that we're going to work with them just as we would work with them if they were still living today. That we could go to them, ask for their prayers, and that they will respond in a prayerful way.
Yeah. Do any of the is there any writings from the early church fathers talking about the saints and the dichotomy between the two, and asking them for help?
Oh, certainly. Not only are there writings of the fathers, but there's also graffiti everywhere you
Oh, really?
go. In the ancient sites, you find graffiti addressed to the saints. There, they used computer software to untangle the mess of graffiti that's all over the original tomb of St. Peter, because people would just go in and scratch their petition over the other petitions that were already there. And they did this for decades, and they did this for centuries. So you have centuries of graffiti there, and you can see the various petitions that are addressed to St. Peter, St. Paul. If you go through the Roman catacombs, you find many, many petitions addressed to saints. You also find prayers that are addressed to God for the sake of the departed, right? Prayers for the holy souls in purgatory, to help them along their way as they complete the purification that's required before their entry into heaven, where nothing impure can enter.
Yeah, I think besides the church fathers mentioning it, but I really think the graffiti is actually a really good indication of what people believed, the laity believed at that period of time. Is like they understood that we were one body and we would be able to communicate with one another even if we passed on from this life.
You find it also in the Holy Land, in the holy sites, especially those that are related to the Blessed Mother, to the Virgin Mary. There are prayers scratched into the site addressed to Mary and asking for her intercession.
Is there uh, because it only comes to mind because social media is what it is, but is there do they talk early church fathers talking about the Blessed Virgin Mary a lot and reference her, or people nowadays, a lot of Protestants kind of minimize her role in all of uh, history, so to speak?
Yes, the answer is yes.
Yes,
You
all the
find
above.
you find some of the earliest writings that we have in the church were related to Mary. There's an Egyptian document called the Ascension of Isaiah, and it's from the first century, written around 70 A.D., and it's largely concerned with Mary, and it assumes that she is revered in the church, and it assumes that she is attacked by those outside the church because it's defending her as well. There's a book from the turn of the century then called The Gospel of Mary. We know it today as the Proto-Evangelion of James, and it's largely devoted to the young life of the Blessed Virgin Mary. You find images of Mary in the catacombs. You find writings about Mary in the church fathers, some of them quite beautiful. You find a council devoted to the doctrine of Mary in the Council of Ephesus, which was chaired by Cyril of Alexandria. It's often called the Seal of the Fathers. Not because it was defining what Mary meant to the church, but because it was simply placing its seal upon what the fathers before then had always taught. And so the writings of the fathers were read aloud at that council in a chain, a catena, so that it would be preserved in the council's record that Mary had always been hailed as the Mother of God, for example, and that she was always sought for her intercession.
Yeah, and I think you see it plays out consistently even today of people attacking Mary as a way to attack the church. But I find my experience now praying more to her. It's just you kind of find the richness of Christ through her, because it seems like Christ honoring his mother, living out fulfilling of the law, coming into this world through this woman who it's indicated in Genesis. There's that enmity between not just the offspring, but also the woman that birthed Christ. And there's good connections to be made that Mary was more than just some woman that birthed the Messiah.
Right, right. And I think that's the message of the Council of Ephesus. But it had been there for centuries before Ephesus. We find Marian prayers in the sands of Egypt, and they're from the beginning of the 200s. The Roman Emperor Julian, who wanted to persecute Christians, mocked them because they were always crying out to the Mother of God he said. And he wanted to show that this title, Mother of God, is illogical because a mother needs to be before her offspring, and no one is before God. Well, Cyril articulated the many arguments against that position at the Council of Ephesus. But we can see that through the critique even of those outside the church, that this was their perception of Christians at the time, that they were intensely devoted to the Blessed Virgin Mary.
Yeah, and I think this actually ties into something I was thinking about. It seems like the best apologists for our faith a lot of times are the early church fathers, because I've seen so many stories nowadays of people diving into different things that were written by those fathers, and how it all always hits them like, oh snap, that's Catholic. Like, it just seems like it's wonderfully how it's been preserved, and how their teachings just is a good way of getting people to the truth of the faith, and maybe leading people to want to understand history, and the drive to want to understand history can lead them back to the Catholic faith.
Yeah, I talked to Marcus Grodi once, and he hosted the Journey Home for many years. He started the Coming Home Network, which helps Protestant pastors on their way to becoming Catholic. He helps them find employment and that sort of thing. But I asked him, of the more than 1,000 people that he welcomed into the church, how many came in by way of the church fathers? And he said, out of 1,000, 1,000. Okay, and since then, I don't even know what the numbers are at, because he's helped a lot of people since then. That was maybe 15 years ago that he told me that.
Wow. And I think that's a good indication of that the laity maybe just do our jobs of being considerate and kind, and kind of revitalize or build up the brand of Catholic, so to speak, and allow people to realize that you are a Catholic, wear it out, let them know that you are, and then allow people, when they're going through the process of researching and diving in, let the fathers speak, let the fathers do their thing, and they'll bring people in when they need, if they're interested in learning more about the faith.
And it'll make you happier. It'll make you happier as a person. It'll make you more fulfilled as a Christian. You know, the church, things didn't always go right for the church fathers. Some of them had really tough last chapters in their lives, like Saint John Chrysostom, who was persecuted by the emperor and exiled and died on a forced march. But he died with joy. He died joyfully, saying, "Glory to God for all things." And we can do the same thing. You know, we can follow the same path and die as joyfully. And I think that's really what we want.
Yeah, and I think it even just giving to other people and being kind to other people, it's so much more fulfilling than when you're giving into your own self desires. You before I came back into the faith, it's everything's about me, and that yet I was more miserable than ever before.
That's right. You know, we get the things we want, and they don't make us really happy, and nothing does. We can keep piling things there, and it's like we got this hole in our heart. We can keep throwing stuff into it, and it never seems to be full. It's always hungry until we find our way to Holy Communion. We feed it with the bread of life.
Speaking of, that's actually a good segue. What did speaking of the bread of life, how did the early fathers actually go about worship? I know you have a whole book on how they worship, but can you give a little brief tidbits on what they believed and what they did?
Well, I think if you go to your church this Sunday, you go to Mass and you watch how the Mass is done, you'll see pretty much what the early church did. I don't think there have been changes in some externals, some details, very few changes in structure, certainly no changes in doctrine, although there's been development of doctrine. It's been made more explicit over time, just in response to some of the challenges that have come up. But the Mass proceeded then as it does now. The Mass meant then what it did, what it means now. It's the same Mass. And yeah, I did write a book about it, The Mass of the Early Christians. I also wrote another book called The Holy Mass for Catholic University of America Press. All of these things I wrote just to give people the evidence that this is it. This is the Mass of the early Christians, and it's the Mass we still celebrate today. So it's all there. The churches are still standing. If you go to places like Ravenna, you can see the churches from ancient times, and they were equipped for the celebration of the Mass. And the pictures on the wall are all related to the celebration of the Mass. So it can be kind of inspiring when we do that.
Yeah, and I mean, looking at old architecture, I just love how they clearly this was a thing of reverence what they were going through, this worship, and they wanted the atmosphere or the environment of where they were worshiping to also signify beauty, which is what a lot of the early cathedrals and early churches um, actually signify, and it just takes your breath away to see how back then they were able to build these massive cathedrals and they're just beautiful. It's a little disappointing these days when you see a new construction of, say, any type of building, and it's nowhere close to the level of beauty that they did, that these quote unquote peasants did back in those
Yeah.
ancient times.
And even just like 150 years ago, people built gorgeous churches, okay, of stone and stained glass and that sort of thing. Now, when we build a church, most of the time it looks like a bank,
Mm-hmm.
and our banks these days are pretty ugly. So, it's inspiring that the people, the ancients, gave the best they could for God, and I look forward to the day when we're doing the same as well.
Yeah, me too. Um, I feel like I have to ask this when it comes to the mass, because there's such a divide where people talk about it. Even though I don't mind either one, what is the early mass? Is it closer to the Novus Ordo, or is it closer to the traditional Latin mass, so to speak? I just have to ask.
It's the same mass. When
Same.
we go to what you call the Novus Ordo, we hear the second Eucharistic prayer, right? And that's the Eucharistic prayer that's preserved in the apostolic tradition of Hippolytus. It may have been pretty old by then, right? And it was preserved in the early 200s. So there is that. When we look at the Latin liturgy that's recorded by St. Ambrose in the 4th century, the late 4th century, we see that it's largely what we know from the Roman canon, from the first Eucharistic prayer. So these are both ancient rites. And when we go to Mass, we're going to these ancient rites, and we're doing what our ancestors did.
And I think that's a good message for anybody, because social media is always a cesspool sometimes with these discussions of tribal. I don't understand how you could be tribal about the way you partake in mass. If it's still in the Catholic, the Church, and you're taking a part of the body of Christ, then should be happy and rejoice in it. And I could see people liking one or the other.
I
But
find the debates boring.
yeah, I mean, debates about certain topics I think are fascinating, but debates on such minuscule, trivial little differences, I feel like are never really that fruitful. It just evolves into something not good. So I was going to end it off as I always do, because we're coming close to the hour mark, which already flew by. I really enjoyed talking with you. The history stuff, I'm always just fascinated. I had to try to catch myself to not just be enthralled and try to make sure to continue the conversation. But as you have grown in your faith, what is something that you partake in that you think that's really improved your spiritual life?
Devotion to the guardian angels. In terms of practical results that I can see, it's probably been the best devotion I ever picked up, at least as far as I can see. God has a better perspective on my life, and He sees all kinds of things that are working that I just don't see. But my confessor, many years ago, when my son was just very small, advised me to deal with my son's guardian angel, greet my son's guardian angel when he walked into the room. And I started doing that, and it really did improve my relationship with my son. And so I started extending that practice to other relationships, and it seems to work to make things better. At least it does for me. It's something very helpful from the tradition. You can find things like this, different ways of expressing devotion to the angels going back to the Old Testament times, even. Certainly there in the New Testament, especially in the example of St. Joseph and of St. Peter in jail. Um, it's helpful in all of our relationships, our spousal relationships, our relationships with the children or parents or neighbors or boss at work or whatever. Just silently in your heart greet the guardian angel.
That's a fascinating take. Maybe I should do that with interviews every time somebody joins on. I would think that our angel would be able to see through the webcam and we would be able to
Absolutely.
communicate. But thank you, Mike, for being on this podcast. This was an amazing dive into history. I really loved it. I love um, talking about this type of stuff, and I look forward to diving more into your books. I don't know if I can get all 50 at once, but I'll slowly work my way through them. But thank you, Mike.
Thank you for having me.
Hey guys, thank you for watching this video. I hope you guys enjoyed this interview. I always enjoyed all the interviews that I do. If you are new to this channel or this podcast, please subscribe to the podcast or the YouTube channel, whichever way you are watching it. If you are on podcast platforms, listen up. Listen, I would like you to subscribe, obviously, and then leave the podcast a 5-star review, whether you are on Spotify or whether you are on Apple Podcasts. That helps the podcast grow. And as always, just share this podcast with your friends and family. Also, share this YouTube video if you just want to share the YouTube video as well. If you're here on YouTube, that is the best way we can grow this community as a whole. And go to adambuckingham.locals.com if you want to join the community and also support the podcast. So hopefully we can do bigger and better things and have bigger and better interviews, and I can interact with all of you all on a one-to-one basis. So go do that, and until next time, I hope you have a blessed week. Bye.